Hello, everyone. My name is Margaret Smith. I'm Executive Director of the Trumpeterswansociety, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar, Red Rock Lakes National Wildlife Refuge, where saving swans began. It'll be a really interesting and informative webinar, and Red Rock Lakes National Wildlife Refuge is really pivotal to the understanding of how swans began to be saved, certainly in the lower 48 states. Just to let you know, today's webinar is being recorded. As participants, if you're attending, you're muted and your video is turned off. We definitely welcome questions, so put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen and we'll answer those at the end of the webinar. And then at the very end of the webinar, when you close your browser, there'll be a very short survey. I look at those very carefully. And so I really appreciate that, your input about what you think about different things. And you will receive a link to the recording in about 2 days after I have a chance to put it up on YouTube. So Zoom will send you an email with the link to the recording. With us today, we have some people from the Trumpeterswansociety who are joining us. There's Jim Hawkins from Yukon, Marianne Coughlin from Massachusetts, who will be asking the questions that you put in the Q&A box. Gary Ivey, you may have seen him at one of our past webinars. He's in charge of our Oregon Restoration Project. And Tiffany Mayo, who's on our board and works with zoos for trumpeter swan cygnets that are released into the Oregon program, and she's our education chair. And before I get to Bill West and Mike Bryant, who will be helping with today's webinar, I just want to tell you a little bit about what the Trumpeterswansociety does. We've been around for more than 50 years, and we have several different program areas. We work in restoration and management, and if you've been to the Oregon Restoration webinar that we had in January, we're working to restore trumpeter swans to Oregon. We're also working with the flyways on an interior population management plan, which is really a management plan for the swans east of the Rockies. We have research, so we have a Trumpeter Swan Citizen Science program, and some of you have submitted Trumpeter Watch reports, and thanks for doing that because your reports are pretty important. We've funded research for GPS tracking projects in the Midwest and in Oregon, and actually if you check our Swan webinar page, you can learn more about those projects. We had some really cool webinars about that. And then every 2 or 3 years, we have a Swan conference, which brings together biologists and agency people and people that are interested in swans and get updates about the latest research. We also do education, and the webinars right now are one of our education programs. But again, if you go to our website, we have free activity books for kids, grades K through 12, and those meet next generation science standards. And again, our webinars, and just to let you know, this Red Rock Lakes webinar is actually a complement to 2 webinars we had in 2024. One was on Harriman State Park of Idaho, and the other one was on Yellowstone National Park. And those are in this greater Yellowstone area that Bill is going to be talking about today. We do outreach and advocacy. You may have heard about our film, Return of the Trumpeters, that's now being shown on PBS. If you want to purchase that, we do have that available now in our gift shop, and we have tons of information on our website. Now, I've been to Red Rock Lakes National Wildlife Refuge, and it's a beautiful place to go to. I've been there 3 times, and I just want to say, if you go, bring a good camera because there's some fabulous photos you can take. Bring binoculars, some good shoes or boots, and good tires on your car. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bill West, who's a retired refuge manager for Red Rock Lakes National Wildlife Refuge, and joining him for questions or other information as needed will be Mike Bryant, who's been the current refuge manager for Red Rock Lakes National Wildlife Refuge. Go ahead, Bill.
Thank you, Margaret. And thank you, Mike, for participating today. I know your job's tough. Anyway, I just would start out by telling you that the picture that you have on my first screen and will be behind me, if you see me in the screen, is of lower Red Rock Lake, looking north towards the Gravelly Mountains. And that is prime trumpeter swan nesting habitat and even migratory habitat until it freezes up the first week of November or so. So I'm going to move through quite a few slides, but a lot of them are maps to try to orient you. And here we go. So I know we have listeners today from all across the United States and provinces of Canada. And we're talking about the Red Rock Lakes Refuge that is right here. You can see my cursor. That is in the very southwest corner of Montana. And this circle I'm making is the Greater Yellowstone. We'll have better maps later, but that gives you some idea of how far west it is. It's the fourth largest state in the United States. And the Greater Yellowstone area is about 20 million acres, of which Yellowstone Park is about 2 million acres. And the 20 million acres, how much is that? Well, if it's about half the size of North Dakota or Wisconsin. So what we're going to try to cover today for you is the history of swans in the Centennial Valley, even before the refuge was there. The refuge, again, is on the west side of Yellowstone Park, about an hour and a half drive away on gravel road. We're going to talk about how the National Wildlife Refuge, this is a National Wildlife Refuge, public land, was established, and that would be because the trumpeter swan near extinction leveraged the politics. We're also going to try to talk about the numbers early on, the numbers during my tenure, and then some numbers of swan recovery during the time that Mike has been the manager there. We'll have some maps again until your probably eyes will glaze over. And then I'll give you some tips about if you want to travel here, because you need to be somewhat prepared. So let's go. So here is a good map of the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. And most of the color and shading, or all of it, is federal public land, which there is a lot of in the West, and especially in the Greater Yellowstone, but it's not all a park. There are 4 principal land management agencies in the U.S. government, and those would be the National Park Service, which is gray here that I'm circling. And so Yellowstone and Grand Teton are national parks. The green is national forests. The yellow or brown are BLM. That's Bureau of Land Management. Those are lands that, and the forests would be similar in that they were lands that were never homesteaded. You know, homesteading was really big in the West. Homestead Act was passed in 1862 under Abraham Lincoln, and it was a way to try to, get people to populate west of the Mississippi. So just another photo to try to get you oriented. This is kind of looking the opposite direction of the earlier photo. This is on the north side of the refuge, looking south across lower Red Rock Lake, and those are the Centennial Mountains in the clouds there. Centennial Mountains run east and west, and they're the Continental Divide, which is one of the few places for about 65 miles that the Continental Divide in North America runs east and west. And that causes weather patterns that we may take a little moment to talk about here in a minute. This is the town of Lakeview, Montana. It's mostly people would refer to as a ghost town. There were probably 500 people in the valley at one time when it was homesteaded. And this was the main town, the post office. The Refuge headquarters is there, and buildings that have survived have mostly all been modernized now. And it's still pretty remote, though it's right in the middle of the valley. So you have about a 27 or 8 mile trip on gravel, whether you're coming in from the east or the west. Okay, now this is upper Red Rock Lake, another part of the Centennial Valley. We're kind of looking southwest here. And you can see the Centennial Mountains are high. They're about at 10,000 feet above a valley floor that's 6,600, 6,700 feet above sea level. So pretty wintry in there in the winter. The Centennial Mountains, again, change the weather, sort of like a really large snow fence. They slow the wind down some, and all the weather coming from the southwest up the Snake River Plain from Idaho Falls or Salt Lake runs into this east-west Continental Divide, and a lot of snow dumps into this valley. So let's take a look at the first map. One of the earliest maps. It's not a map to scale, but it is a famous map. It's pretty artistic. It was created by J.V. Brower, and we refer to it as the Brower map. He published it in 1897, based on a couple of trips he made here in the summers of 85 and 86. And so Brower was in the valley to try to establish where the utmost point of the Missouri River is. And that is not a headwater, just a headwater. You know, the Lewis and Clark went over a headwater to get, up the Missouri, up the Jefferson, and then eventually over into the Pacific watershed. But that is still about 70 miles downstream of the utmost point of the Missouri River, which is, I'm going to use my cursor here, it's about right in here. Idaho is down here, Idaho is over here, but this little piece of Montana is still watershed that's headed to the Gulf. And the spring that is the first water is known as Brower Spring now. And this has been established by the Corps of Engineers and agreed by the Montana Department of Natural Resource and Conservation. It's 3,768 miles from New Orleans. The Mississippi has its own utmost point, but it's not nearly as far away from St. Louis as the Missouri's utmost point. So makes it the fourth longest river in the world, behind the Amazon, the Nile, the Yangtze. So there's the route of the river. So using my cursor again, you're right here in the very southwest part of Montana, and the river runs 70 miles west before it finally turns north. And somewhere around Great Falls, Montana, it got its names right. There were great falls there, the Missouri River. It turns in the direction that you would expect if it was going to try to get to the Atlantic Ocean. So another map, a lot of public lands in the west. The colors are a little different here than in the earlier map, but this is specific just to the Centennial Valley. So the Centennial Valley is about this area that I'm giving you my cursor with. It's nearly 500,000 acres. Yellowstone Park is 2 million acres, but a lot of Yellowstone is another 1,000 feet higher than this area. And you can see that there are several different federal lands. So the Forest Service is in green. The Bureau of Land Management is in yellow. National Wildlife Refuges is turquoise. There is no National Park Service land in this, but the blue land is state land. State school trust land raises funds for the school systems in Montana, but it is public land that is mostly without housing development, things like that on it. So here's the other half of that Breyer map, and we're going to compare it to a Google Earth map here in a minute, but just wanted to show that historically, by 1895, people plenty well knew that there were prehistoric sites in the valley. There's one here, and there's another one up here. Those are both at Spring Heads. Kind of bummer that most of the material that was on the surface was all picked up by homesteaders, arrowheads, other things. Another thing to note that was noted by Mr. Brower is this statement here: level buffalo plain over which are scattered bleaching bones, skulls, and horns. Buffalo trails and wallows abound. So this would have been from his visit in 1895. Okay, that is 35 years after the last bison died in this area. So mining started in Montana in about 1860, and people were coming either from the east to get away from the war, or they were coming from California where the gold mines were slowing down, and gold mines were being opened up in Montana in the southwest part of the state here. And so bison died to feed a lot of miners. The refuge does have grazing by cattle to try to replicate the ecological service that bison might have had to this environment. This is a big grassy valley, high quality grass. Ranchers have sometimes told me that a cow will gain weight in the Centennial Valley just looking at the grass. So here's the same location in a Google Earth map. It's a Google Earth aerial photo. And so you can see that these are the wetlands that the refuge is protecting and indirectly protecting wildlife at the same time. You need to know that there are probably 25 decent to really quality nesting sites in this area, but most of them are in areas with emergent vegetation or islands. Lower Lake is the best habitat. There's also nests over here. You don't find nests just like along the banks too often of a big, this is a 2,500 acre lake. Both of them are natural lakes, though. There is a low dam at the outlet now of Lower Red Rock Lake. I would say with the problems we have with climate drying things up a little bit, it's fortunate that there is a dam there. Anyway, this is the largest wetland complex in the 20 million acre Greater Yellowstone. Okay, to try to reorient you one last time before we head off into stories. Here's the National Wildlife Refuge we're talking about. And this is the border between Idaho and Montana. And the earlier, related talk that Margaret was mentioning at the beginning about Harriman State Park, which is right down here in the Island Park area, or Yellowstone Park, both the stories of swans in those two locations, you can start to see, this is Swan Central in the Western United States back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And so it's also where the last vestige of swans might have been when trumpeter swan numbers were thought to be down to just 69 or so in the United States, maybe even in all of North America. Okay, so a lot of what impacted Montana, especially the western half of Montana, was all related to the mining that was going on in Butte. You've all probably heard of Butte, Montana, but I'm trying to help you with the juxtaposition of Butte to the Refuge, and to explain that the change started happening when Butte became what later became known as the richest hill on earth. It was copper mining, and it meant that there was a financial reason that a railroad should be built to Montana. So the first railroad to ever touch the edge of the Montana border was right here at Monida. Mon for Montana, Ida for Idaho. This is Monida Pass. And, this would be the Pacific watershed. This is the Missouri watershed. And that arrived in March of 1880. It still took it till 1882 to get to Butte. But once that happened, people could do what normally would take them a wagon and maybe a half a week to get that distance. They could be all the way from Butte to Monida in a few hours on a train. It also meant that all kinds of industrial equipment and transport was now possible to Butte. So we'll talk about Butte occasionally as it relates to Red Rocks. So besides being known as the richest hill on earth, some people have called it the city that ate itself. This is the Berkeley Pit. It was the way copper eventually was mined, surface mining. And it wiped out a big part of the town. And that's just where they found the copper. So that's where they kept going. There were big smelters in the area. The smelters, had toxic high heavy metal smoke. And, this mining site, the Berkeley Pit, the smelter country, is all the largest Superfund site in the United States, trying to clean it up. So here's another map that's pretty interesting. This is the mining that was done underground before the Berkeley Pit. The Berkeley Pit is this black thing here, and all of these others are all the different mine shafts that were, carved down to as far as 3,000 feet below town, and these are all the tunnels that resulted off of those shafts. So a lot of copper came out of there, and with money follows politics. So let's go back to Monida Pass, and what was built there early on was a hotel, and it's a pretty inhospitable place in the winter at that pass. But in the summertime, it quickly became a primary commercial route to get tourists into Yellowstone National Park. Yellowstone Park had been designated as the first national park probably in the world in 1872. And so the railroad, as I said, touched that location in 1880, 8 years later. And the Monida to Yellowstone stage developed. And by 1886, they were hauling lots of people way up into the early 1900s. It was a 2-day stagecoach ride. 61 coaches were used. Some days they were all occupied, and they took them through the Centennial Valley, which when you drive it today, it's hard to believe that there were a lot more people in the Centennial Valley in the past. So it also meant that homesteaders could come look at and make choices about where they might want to homestead. So by 1885, homesteading was well along in the valley, and yet that was a outside income for a lot of folks who were homesteading the land in an agriculture way, but they could also make outside income from, supporting this summertime of tourists on the stagecoach. So they could raise horses, sell horses, train horses, lease horses to the stage lines. They could put people up at night. They could feed people. And everyone was into making some money during the summer in an alternate way to agriculture. And so one of the bigger investments that went in by some of the homesteaders was to build the Shambo stage stop right in the middle of the valley in 1914. But the Yellowstone National Park, because of all the conflict between cars that now are being used to get into the park, conflicting with stagecoaches, we're talking, backfiring cars and scared horses, and then people scared, and horses pulling, tons of people up hills and going slow. All those things meant that the Park Service outlawed the stagecoaches, and investments like this went bankrupt, and the valley became dependent just on agriculture income, mostly. There was some overnight housing and things still going on to guide duck hunters or to provide for hunting in the area. So homesteaders also lived off the local wildlife. You can see a trumpeter swan there. Was one of the critters that was considered fair to shoot. And until 1900, when the state of Montana outlawed the sale of wildlife or wild fish, people made income selling those wild critters to minors. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how we got going with saving swans in this area. So this is the Greater Yellowstone again. I'll go back. The blue in this case is the Forest Service. The orange is the National Park Service. The brown is private, and the dark brown is BLM, and the yellow are National Wildlife Refuges. Okay, I'm going to tell you about George Melendez Wright here in a moment, but I will say that the federal government of the United States already recognized that maybe a National Wildlife Refuge would be an appropriate thing to have in the Centennial Valley around the two Red Rock Lakes. And that was as early as 1922. And there were actually engineers sent into the valley to evaluate, botanists and to evaluate the location before the government would try to repurchase homesteads that were becoming not very economical for the people that had homesteaded, but also a higher use might be as a wildlife refuge. But the politics of Butte pushed back on that. They liked their duck hunting. They liked their duck clubs. And so the idea did not go anywhere in 1922. But there were surveys done that are still baselines of what, let's say, the botany or the plant life in those two lakes were, because there was no dam on Lower Lake at that time. The first dam was built by the Butte Sportsman's Club in 1930. And it wasn't a very fish-friendly dam. But about 9 years later or so, along came George Melendez Wright. Now, the story about George is George, as a young fellow, was living in San Francisco. His mother was from El Salvador, and his father was a ship's captain. And somewhere in his early youth, his mother passed away, and George's brother was sent back to El Salvador to that part of the family. And George stayed with his dad, but his dad died 4 years later, and his dad was quite wealthy. But George lived with his great aunt at that point. And his great aunt lived right next door to the professor of zoology, Joseph Grinnell, at California, Berkeley. And George was mentored by his great aunt and by Joseph Grinnell to study zoology and natural resources, something that was a fairly new profession in the late 1920s. And then George was able to get hired as the first biologist of the National Park Service. And he was stationed in Yellowstone National Park. He wasn't a very big man. He was very kind fellow, but very fierce in trying to make the case that some of the things that superintendents were doing in the park, like setting up bleachers so people could watch grizzly bears eat garbage all night, were not very holistic ways of looking at how to manage the park. And so after his dad died and he inherited this money, he asked if he could hire his own staff, and his goal would be to inventory all of the resources on all of the national parks in the United States. And they gave him the go-ahead, and he hired 19 people. And in his plan to try to survey, he came into the Centennial Valley and realized that while most people thought trumpeter swans were about to go extinct, that there were just a few around, there was still a decent population of them in the Centennial Valley. By this time, George was in Washington, D.C., running the biology for the entire National Park Service, and he was able to talk to Jay and or Ding Darling. We like to refer to him as Ding Darling. There's a refuge National Wildlife Refuge in Florida on Sanibel Island that's known as the Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge. Well, so who was Ding Darling? Ding Darling was a Pulitzer Prize winning cartoonist for the Des Moines, Iowa Register newspaper. He had won the Pulitzer Prize twice, and he especially had a conservation slant to his critical cartoons that were a thorn in the side to Franklin Delano Roosevelt during his tenure as president. And somewhere during FDR's presidency, he, as a Democrat, told Ding Darling, who was a Republican, why don't you just come and manage the U.S. Biological Survey for us? And Ding took him up on it. And Ding transformed the National Wildlife Refuge system in the United States from one that had been started by Teddy Roosevelt back in 1903 to 1908 It mostly had been dealing with setting aside what was already federal land into National Wildlife Refuge designations, and basically starting what we refer to as the National Wildlife Refuge System. And a lot of the protections were of plumed birds on islands off the coasts, and large mammals like bison or elk. So we have the National Elk Refuge, the National Bison Range, the Wichita Mountains in Oklahoma Bison Range. And so Ding Darling transferred that thinking into saving wetlands and saving waterfowl and water birds also. But what else did he do? He helped start the duck stamp system in America. Federal waterfowl duck stamp is required by anyone who hunts ducks or geese in the United States. And Ding Darling penned the first stamp, which is the 3435 stamp. And that stamp now raises about $50 million a year that is used to buy wetlands or restore. Well, you buy the land and then restore the wetlands. There are three stamp things to talk about related to Red Rock Lakes. One, Red Rock Lakes is a Ding Darling refuge. It was established during his tenure, and he only ran the biological survey for 20 months, but he made so many changes in those 20 months. So in 1950-51, the federal duck stamp was of 2 trumpeter swans at Red Rock Lakes National Wildlife Refuge. And in today's time, the current federal duck stamp for the United States is a pintail that was inspired by a trip that the artist made to Red Rock Lakes National Wildlife Refuge. He tells his story on YouTube, and if you want to remember this, you can come back and maybe do a screenshot when the show is up on YouTube. So, a tragic thing happened. 1 year after Red Rock Lakes was established, 1936, George Melendez Wright, who is today the namesake of the National Parks research site. You can go look up George Wright Society online. He was in a car wreck while down near Big Bend, surveying Big Bend National Park, and was killed. But this fellow, Harold Ickes, was the Secretary of Interior at the time, the longest serving Secretary of Interior in the history of the United States. That position is over the Park Service, the BLM, Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Minerals and Mining. He was also over the Works Projects Administration, which was one of the things to help people get through the Great Depression by putting them to work. Anyway, this guy did a lot in 13 years working under FDR and for a while under Harry Truman. But Harold was so impressed with what had happened with George Melendez Wright's establishment of a place to protect a nearly extinct trumpeter swan that, oh, by the way, just over the mountains, over Red Rock Pass at Henry's Lake, Idaho, an Army general had set up an Army winter training facility on public land in the Henry's Lake area. And he did that in 39 or so, which would be, 4 years after the refuge was established, which was 35. And by the time people started worrying about it, what they were learning was there were already 5,000 soldiers there. There was already 1 million yards of concrete had been poured, and the goal was to have 35,000 soldiers there. And they were going to do their military exercises in the Centennial Valley on the north side of the valley, which would be the north side of what is now the National Wildlife Refuge. So Harold Ickes picked up the idea of trying to push back on the general moving forward with his plans for an even bigger winter training center. And he had to talk with Roosevelt himself. And it was a while of conversation before Roosevelt eventually did tell his general to move out of Henry's Lake. And that message came to the general just days before the invasion of Pearl Harbor. Or we might have a totally different environment in the Greater Yellowstone. And the trumpeter swan was the reason that happened. So another pivotal figure is Winston Banco. He was the refuge manager at Red Rock Lakes National Wildlife Refuge from 1948 to 1957. And he was very focused on doing what he could to try to bring the swan back from near extinction. I will mention that by the time he had left in 57, biologists had determined that the trumpeter swan was not extinct in Canada or Alaska. It was just depressed. And so that's when we started better understanding the difference between more migratory trumpeter swans, like those coming out of Alaska and Canada, and those that were more regional populations, like the Greater Yellowstone population that pretty much nests and winters within 100 or 200 miles of the same location. So when Banco left, he published a book. Scientists would call it a monograph. It's basically much longer than an average research paper. That is, a lot of people consider it the Swan Bible. It'll tell you everything about how we got to almost going extinct with trumpeter swans. It was quite popular, so popular that the government ran out of their publications. And what happened was that the Nebraska Press republished it in 1980, and it's still available. And it's free to download on the Trumpeterswansociety website if you want, or you can go to Google Books, and there's no copyright on it because it's it's public, so no cost. I took this to start talking about numbers for you. I took this out of Banco's book, Figure 46, page 152. And you can see that back when George Melendez Wright was first there was, somewhere around 30 swans in the Centennial Valley, Red Rock Lakes area. And over time, I think Banco would have gotten there about 1948, right in here. And swans seem to be doing well. And, you need to know that the way the federal government decided to handle swan management in the Centennial was to feed the swans in spring-fed, ice-free locations of just 1 to 2 open acres and feed them grain all winter long. to keep them from migrating out of the valley where the risks of crossing state lines with different enforcement of hunting regulations and stuff could mean that they would never return. So they were raising them year round in a fairly hostile valley, pretty hostile winter-wise. So I will just point out that these are kind of odd, gyrations of numbers, and what they do recognize is a couple of things that maybe Banco was postulating on, and what I can tell you on. You see that the non-breeders, we all know that trumpeter swans take about 6 years to get to their reproductive age, and they are occasionally in the count and occasionally not, because they move around. So the breeder numbers is what we need to look at here. And so we were still under 100, even by the time Banco left and wrote his book. Okay, so here's another piece of history for you. You could look this up. It's a publication from the Trumpeter Swan Society, Ruth Shea, E.O. Garton, and I.J. Ball. It's mostly about the history from 1931 to 86. And it was republished by the Trumpeter Swan Society in July of 2013. So how did the Refuge manage things? For 57 years, they fed trumpeter swans, and that required Refuge staff to travel 24 miles round trip twice a week in a contraption like this with, an airplane motor on the back of a car body with a ski underneath it. Sometimes they were feeding in, 36 below weather. But by 1991, and if I would also say, if you watch the Harriman State Park companion talk that's online that can be linked at the Trumpeter Swan Society website, it was clear that there weren't just 100 swans being fed at these 1 to 2 acre locations. There were 400 to 800 swans. And what had happened is that the Canadian Rockies part of the trumpeter swan population had recovered, and they had found the feed lines at Red Rock Lakes. And so a 1 to 2 acre of water, 400 to 800 swans is a disease or starvation likelihood. So winter feeding needed to end. So the goal, as I write here, of no longer feeding was to encourage migration out of the Centennial Valley in the winter. Swans from the Canadian Rocky Mountains were wintering in the Snake River Plain too, all this country here. So here's Yellowstone, here's Red Rock Lakes. You had some swans, like a Harriman State Park country, but they were also able to feed in the Snake River Plain on waste potatoes and grain from the previous growing season, and farmers welcomed the cleanup. But that was the hope, that the swans that had been pretty much encouraged to stay in the valley for 57 years would figure out that it was a better business model, annual model for their livelihood, to get out and forage on lower lands where there was lots of food. So how did that go? Here's a graph that was produced during my tenure. So here is the beginning, right after feeding ended. The numbers were as low as, 50 birds in the valley. This is adults and cygnets. So this would be like a September flight, aerial flight to count. And these are all accounts, you don't, even a big white bird and you're up in an airplane, you don't always find them all. But, you do a pretty good job. And so the trend over the next 25 years, I retired in 2019, was upward. Now, the most recent information was the fall survey last September, and this was produced by Dave Olson, who is the migratory bird biologist for the 8 states of the National Wildlife Refuge System and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It's run out of the Denver area. So some of these are his. He would remind us that these are the populations of swans in the Midwest now, places where there are lots of lakes, lots of water. For example, Minnesota has 10,000 lakes. You know, plenty of lakes up here in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. But here's the Greater Yellowstone. And focus in a little bit. The orange is the Greater Yellowstone that we've always talked about. And swans have expanded out, but there just aren't as many wetlands in the West. It's a drier climate, you know, 10 to 20 inches of moisture, depending on where you're at. You know, Eastern Oregon, probably closer to 10. So how did they do? So this is interesting. So we know that we started feeding swans, and this is just the Greater Yellowstone, of which Red Rock Lakes is the most productive part of the Greater Yellowstone for swans, no doubt. George Melendez Wright had that figured out a long time ago. But by 66, that we got this graph. Don't want to get you too hung up on all the numbers, but just know that over time, from 66, when the birds might have recovered back to over 500 from that 30 some 69, the trend was down over time. It wasn't sustainable to continue to try to feed swans. And by the time right in here is when we quit feeding, we now have a different graph.
Hi,
This is
Bill.
the graph.
This is Mary Ann. I'm just doing a time check that we have about 8 minutes remaining.
Okay, thank you, Mary Ann. So the upward trend since would tell us that the birds needed to make it on their own. And it was good that we quit feeding. And the 800 number that we're approaching may be as much as the habitat in this drier western habitat of the Greater Yellowstone can handle. You know, trumpeter swans live 20 plus years. They don't leave their territories. So birds are going to have to find places to nest far away, and they may be moving back up into Canada. So here's the most recent counts in the Greater Yellowstone are right here. And just to give you, since I retired, these are the numbers of cygnets produced each year. And last fall, there were 182 in the whole Greater Yellowstone. That's 3 states, Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana. And 90 or half, basically, of the entire production was in the Red Rock Lakes Centennial Valley. So I just real quickly would say that there are 4 principal public land agencies, and that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has a lot of those acres. If we just use this bison as a color coding of acres, National Wildlife Refuges are this much of the public land acres that North America or of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service refuge system. This is the BLM acres. This is the Forest Service acres, and this is the Park Service acres. But far fewer employees at 2,000 versus 30,000, 19,000, 9,000. So you get a lot for your money, but we don't directly usually invite a lot of people to wildlife refuges because it's wildlife first. But you can come. So Red Rock Lakes National Wildlife Refuge history that I just tried to cover, I'll summarize by saying it's a lot like the Field of Dreams baseball that Kevin Costner was in, that the players came once the field was built. Well, the initial priority of Red Rock Lakes was trumpeter swans. That wasn't in the executive order at all. It was for wetlands and water birds. And actually, a lot of things have come back. You know, elk have come back, deer, moose, Arctic grayling, which is a fish, pronghorn, wolf, grizzly bear, sage grouse, songbirds. It's a pretty amazing place. The most abundant moose population in Montana, most abundant sage grouse population in southwest Montana. Wolves have returned, grizzly bears have returned, and this is the southernmost population of native Arctic grayling on the planet that never went extinct. Most of the grayling, native grayling, are in the lower 48 are gone. So this is a gravel road you can look at. Camping, there's 2 campsites, camping areas, campgrounds on the refuge, or you could stay down closer to Harriman State Park, which there's Forest Service campgrounds. In the Henry's Lake area, there is a state park that has both tent camping and RV. And then there are commercial RV parks also around Henry's Lake. But the roads are poor. Here's a poorer road, a little bit better road, but they're all gravel. This is the most recent addition to the refuge, Alaska Basin, we call it. And I think it's time for questions.
Great. Thank you, Bill. I really enjoyed that. I know I learned a lot, and I'm really glad you were able to cover so many stories of the history because, I certainly don't want those lost to time. So I really appreciate you, making sure that those stories are not forgotten. Marianne, are there any questions? And everyone, we do encourage you to ask some questions, please.
Yes, Margaret, our first question for Bill is if there is a best time of year and a best place on the refuge to view trumpeter swans.
Well, there is a gravel road, a 1-lane gravel road that will take you down to Lower Lake. And that's your best place to view them. You probably will find some down there, but they're not going to be wanting you to get too close. And I would say that they don't hatch their cygnets till June 15th. And so you would probably have the pair being hyper protective until at least a month later, maybe July 15th. I think August and September are the times I enjoy the valley the most, and the roads are usually pretty dry, even if they are, gravel, and they're just not as much mud in those August and September.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from the audience? Let's see, I do see some coming in. The first one is, are there still political or economic obstacles to the refuge besides underfunding? And I think we want to not talk about maybe anything in the current political environment, since this is going to be a long-term website, but if there are any, I would say, overall long-term political or economic obstacles to the refuge.
Yeah, so the valley is quite unique at trying to, and I think the demeanor of the communities has always been more problem solving. So even though there might be political views that are different, the idea that there are grizzly bears in what might be cattle country, maybe some grumbling about it, but you have environmental groups and the refuge trying to help mitigate any problems between large predators and the cattle industry by setting up ways, things like range riding and carcass management, getting carcasses off the landscape so that you're not attracting a lot of grizzly bears to your cattle. And they've been quite successful. And I guess this idea of working across the landscape, trying to help each other's business models is still a part of this valley, and hopefully will be into the future.
Thank you. The next question is whether with northern trumpeters coming through, is there an increase in migration?
Well, Mike might be able to say what's happened the last few years. We noticed the migration the most in the right around Halloween, or the first week of November, possibly, depending on how the weather goes. But both tundra swans and trumpeter swans show up at Lower Lake, and they keep the water from freezing until they can no longer do that. And I've seen as many as 5,000 trumpeters and 5,000 tundras at the same time. So it's a really great time to try to tell the two of them apart. But it seems that the numbers that we see at Red Rocks may not always be indications of how they're doing continent wide. We just know that when the conditions are right, there's plenty of feed for a lot of swans. Mike might know more.
I just echo what you said, Bill. November is the high point. We try to count the ones that are breeding here in late September, so that's a much smaller number. I think you showed the graph for 24, like 500 birds here in the valley then. So, yeah, but visitors need to keep in mind that November, it's kind of hit and miss for when the big lakes will freeze. It's usually in November, so plan very carefully, contact the refuge staff to get current conditions if people want to see a lot of birds.
The next question is, what duck species are found in the refuge and are they hunted?
So the National Wildlife Refuge System has early on was a complete refuge system, but that sort of drove away what I would call different constituencies that might be more into wanting to help spend money to buy wetlands. And the whole duck stamp idea of buying wetlands, of creating refuges and then not letting anybody duck hunt didn't go over well early in the refuge system. So 40% of a refuge can be open, and managers figure out how to make that work best for the resource at various different refuges. There are 560 refuges in America now. Those acreages I were giving you, but I would just say that yes, there is hunting. Lesser scaup are the best known for what are raised here, but there are lots of puddle ducks, mallards, gadwalls, widgeon, a variety of all kinds of waterfowl can be here. What we don't have is snow geese, which is good because usually snow geese are hunted, and with that, it's not difficult to know that a big white bird in the Centennial Valley is not a snow goose, it's a trumpeter swan.
We previously had another webinar that covered lead poisoning in swans and the dangers. And our next question is whether you're seeing any lead shot problems in the Red Rock Lakes area.
Mike may want to fill in on this, but I'll just say that we know that lead is out there from all the years that there were duck clubs here. But lead being heavier than most soils, it's probably worked its way down into the soil quite a ways. You can't hunt waterfowl on the refuge with anything other than steel shot now. It's been that way for 25, 30 years. And in the last 20 years, you can't even fish with lead tackle anywhere in the refuge because we don't want lead sinkers and things like that giving swans problems.
I think you covered it, Bill.
The
Thank
next
you, Mike.
question is whether or not, with all of the funding cuts to U.S. federal programs, and some of which have affected national parks, is Red Rock Lakes being affected by any funding cuts, and would that impact people's ability to visit the refuge?
This may mean that you won't have as much guarantee that the refuge is going to help you if you make a mistake. So you better plan. And the best thing would be to get information, as Mike said, by calling the refuge before you come, so you can get up to date on the conditions. But yeah, I think all agencies in the federal government of the United States right now are trying to figure out how to at least do what they've done in the past with less. And Red Rocks is not immune to that. And yet there are a lot of folks who support the refuge system and are trying to figure out ways to step up. So that's kind of where we're at until we have some idea of where all this is headed.
Our next question is about the data that you presented, wondering if iNaturalist is being used as a means of data collection, and if so, are sightings and postings indicating any data that suggests improvement or decline in swan populations?
I'm not familiar with iNaturalist, so I can't really answer that. If Mike is, maybe he could handle that otherwise.
The current biologist at the refuge she pays attention to iNaturalist and has shared some of the data collected, but it really hasn't been relative or relevant, I should say, to trumpeter swans. So I think there's more of that to come if more and more visitors are starting to use that and post their findings on iNaturalist. And so we're looking forward to more citizen science going forward.
The next question is, were there any other factors besides remoteness that made the Red Rock Lakes a place where trumpeter swans persisted when they were disappearing in the neighboring areas?
Well, I would say that there are no trees out there. So tree nesting predators like bald eagles or golden eagles or ravens have a harder time navigating, trying to take over a swan nest. And the advent of all the islands and places that make it difficult for things like coyotes to, invade a nest are just naturally more likely to support cygnets making it to flight stage. A lot of the lakes, I think, in Yellowstone National Park have trees around them, and so some of the nests that have the most trouble there might have eagles taking the cygnets. And the cob can fight off quite a bit, but I don't know if he can fight off a bald eagle day in, day out for, the 4 months or so that might take for a cygnet to get to flight stage.
Well, thank you. Those are the questions. We have several comments that this was thanking you for an excellent presentation. So just wanted to share that as well. So Margaret, those are all of the questions.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for coming, and I want to thank Bill West and Mike Bryant for being here and helping us learn more about Red Rock Lakes National Wildlife Refuge, which is really like a super important refuge for trumpeter swans. When you close your browser, you will get the very brief survey, which I highly encourage you to fill out, and you will be getting a link to the recording in a couple days that'll come through YouTube. So thank you so much to everyone for attending and our panelists and speakers. It was great to have you here, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you.